You might have already seen YouTube flooding with videos pointing towards an upcoming financial turmoil in the United States. Whatever you call it, recession, depression, or economic downturn, this could only go two ways. This year could be the lead towards the greatest comeback in history, or simply the start of a downhill journey as bad as we feared. I have to say that we still haven't fully grasped the implications of the truth behind this news as we head towards the new year. If you recall past incidents, you'll see that this country hasn't undergone continuous economic hardships since 2009. Fun fact, there wouldn't be anyone who invested in the S&P 500 that wouldn't have made money in just 3 years since the crash in 2008. Ever since the major crash, every other downturn has been recovered much more vigorously. With all these swift recoveries and developments, the horrific memories of economic turmoil have slowly started to fade away from the American mind. The concept of a crash or economic pain is so trivial now. People are blinded with the current bumpy state of the market, since they believe this is what economic pain looks like. It is true that this period has been hard on some, with lost jobs. However, the recovery was rather quick, even in the most recent 2-year dip, where the S&P dropped by over 25%. We have gradually witnessed all losses in the S&P 500 erased in a rally that began as far back as October of 2022. This video is not focused on recent statistics, but on a much more important factor. A future crash is imminent, but many have failed to grasp the potential dangers of this recession. And to understand this situation better, we need to look back in time. A crash at this time would easily defeat the severity of the Great Depression. Now see how bad it could get? This is where the video takes a turn. Many people aren't aware of how seriously the Great Depression altered the course of this country. Don't forget that history can repeat itself. To shed light on the severity, I'll let the expert do the talking. Back in 2020, Warren Buffett stated these important facts at his annual Berkshire conference. By constantly drawing parallels with the events of 1929. You might think it's ancient history, but believe me, the whole situation is quite similar to the current situation than you might anticipate. Take a listen to this rather alarming information he shares.
The 1929 crash, which led to the Great Depression. And here, the Dow Jones average, which we'll use through this, at that time, that's the one everybody paid attention to. Actually, the second most important average at that time, if you look at the papers, was the New York Times average, which has disappeared. And of course, the Standard & Poor's has probably regarded as a superior yardstick, but the Dow Jones is a perfectly adequate yardstick. And on September 3rd, 1929, the Dow Jones average closed at 381.17, and people were very happy, and buying stocks on margin had worked wonderfully in the roaring 20s. Had a good feeling to it with the auto coming of age and the day of air travel coming along and all kinds of new appliances and the telephone getting wider use. Believe it or not, it hadn't really caught on that much prior thereto, but the movies were coming on. It was a happy place. And then, of course, if we'll move to the next slide, we'll look at what happened in the couple of months after September 3rd. And the Dow Jones average almost got cut in half. And that was pretty impressive until we had this recent situation where in a shorter period of time, we lost about a third. But the crash.
Just as you need the past to understand the future, to understand the Great Depression, you need to know its genesis. It all started on October 24th, 1929, on a day known as Black Thursday, as the market dropped 11%, which caused the whole country to go on a downward spiral. This is the moment that completely altered the country. A few days later, on Black Tuesday, which is arguably the most famous day in New York Stock Exchange history, the stocks fell 12%. In the blink of an eye, the so-called Roaring Twenties came to an end, as happiness and positivity was no longer existent. By November 1929, the Dow Jones had fallen off by 48% from its recent peak. With all these misfortunes, people expected the world and the United States to be in shambles. But guess what? The following summer of 1930, in the midst of this economic storm, Warren Buffett was born. That year, people were going back to being positive, but a shocking turn of events occurred, which teaches us how volatile the market is. Listen to Warren Buffett explain this unexpected turn of events.
I was born about 9 months later, but at that time, I was actually born on August 30th, but the stock market was closed that day, and so I'm using the previous day's figures. But it wasn't, I didn't notice at the time that the market was closed, but the stock market had actually recovered over 20% during that 9.5 month period or thereabouts. People did not think in the fall of 1930, they did not think they were in a Great Depression. They thought it was a recession very much like had occurred at least a dozen times, although not always when stock markets were important. But we'd had many recessions in the United States over the time, and this did not look like it was something dramatically out of the ordinary. And for a while, actually for about 10 days after my birth, that view held on, and the stock market actually managed to go up all of 1 or 2% there in those 10 days.
A sense of optimism was in the air, even in the midst of these events. People believed they would have an epic comeback from this drop, but little did they know, they were already experiencing the Great Depression. Around September 10th, 1930, the Dow Jones showed a reading of 245, making a remarkable recovery of more than 25% since the initial panic drop. Why are these dates important? Why do we need to know this specific information? These numbers set a reminder of what unfolded after this apparent rebound and of what would come our way during the next big crash. Later, in September 1930, the Dow Jones average fell down all the way to 41.22. The Great Depression bottomed out on July 8, 1932. From a stock market perspective, as people who invested at the top had lost 90% of their money. At this point, there was zero faith in the stocks as a serious financial instrument. Keep in mind, this was only the beginning of the crisis. If you are expecting to hear a story of a quick recovery, this may not be for you. The Dow Jones Industrial wouldn't recover back to its peak of 1929 until 25 years later. During financial adversities, a piece of advice mostly spread is to be greedy when things are bad. It may come in handy on some occasions, but if you see clearly, even the strongest corporations had trouble having a balance in the bumpy economy back then. Imagine spending 25 years of your life to achieve a previously achieved peak. The American economy at the time barely moved. What you shouldn't forget is that during the height of the Depression, about 25% of the workforce had lost their jobs, and the rest had their wages cut by 42%. And to add to that, farmers lost their lands and homes as farm prices fell drastically. The hungry farming population migrated, building Hooverville shantytowns across the nation. The hopeless youth rode rails and boxcars in gangs to find jobs, and you can see how tedious this task was, with how far industry had fallen down the pit. Businesses and labor both faced serious issues. The Great Depression was a remarkably astonishing event. Those words truly ought to bring out those horror memories that scarred the past generations. But interestingly, these precisely detailed stories of the Great Depression had been etched in our minds for so long that it only very recently started to fade away, slowly. With all the good times we've experienced ever since, we've come to believe that our economy has an unbending armor around it. In fact, our standards have become so high, a small dip is what's considered at economic pain. Danger is lurking just around the corner, with the recent hit of S&P on record prices. It can be deemed that we're on a path headed towards the second Great Depression. If this is the case, it will change the future generations drastically. I won't leave you with bad news, so let's take another listen to what Warren Buffett has stated.
If you think about the fact that we're enduring a few months, and we'll endure many more months, but and we don't know how it comes out. And people in the 30s didn't know how it was going to come out, but they endured, persevered, prospered, and the American miracle continued. But it's interesting in that I actually don't have a slide for the next one, because last night I was thinking, after all the slides had been prepared, I was actually thinking about this a little bit, and I remembered that at the start of 1954, the stock market the Dow was only at about 280. And I remember 1954 because it was the best year I ever had in the stock market. And the Dow went from essentially, 280 or thereabouts at the start of the year to a little over 400 at the end of the year. And when it went to 400, as soon as when it crossed 381, that famous figure from 1929, when it went to 400, this will be hard for some of you to believe, but everybody wondered, is this 1929 all over again? And that seems a little far-fetched, because it was a different country in 1954. But that was the common question, and it actually achieved. It achieved such a level of worry about whether we were about to jump off another cliff, just because the 381 of 1929 had been exceeded, that they held Senator Fulbright, Bill Fulbright of Arkansas, who became very famous later in terms of the Foreign Relations Committee, but he headed the Senate Banking Committee, and he called a special for a special investigation, and he called it the the stock market study. But it really, if you read through it, he really was questioning whether we had built another house of cards again. And on his committee, when he testified, the Dow at 404, he had one line in there right toward the start in his written testimony, and he said, the stock market is high, looks high, it is high, but it's not as high as it looks. But he said it is high. And since that time, if we'll turn to the next slide, of course, we felt the American tailwind at full force, and the Dow, well, let's see, when the Dow went down Friday, but when we made the slide, it was about 24,000. So you're looking at a market today that has produced $100 for every dollar. All you had to believe in America and just buy a cross-section of America. You didn't have to read the Wall Street Journal. You didn't have to look up the price of your stock. You didn't have to pay a lot of money in fees to anybody. You just had to believe that the American miracle was intact. But you'd had this testing period between 1929 and certainly 1954 is indicated by what happened when it got back up to 380. You had this testing period, and people really, they'd lost faith to some degree. They just didn't see the potential of what America could do. And we found that nothing can stop America when you get right down to it. And it's been true all along. It may have been interrupted with the scariest of scenarios when you had a war with one group of states fighting another group of states. And it may have been tested again in the Great Depression, and it may be tested now to some degree. But in the end, the answer is never bet against America. And that, in my view, is as true today as it was in 1789.
Warren's history lesson wasn't meant to be a scare tactic. Instead, it had a final message that was quite unique if you listened to the rest carefully. With all that said and done, one thing is for certain: America will always find a way. And this was the main message conveyed through all of this. The last 6 generations faced countless challenges, from world wars, civil wars, terrorism, assassinations, and even pandemics. America sustained through all of these and eventually recovered. Let's look at it this way. On July 8, 1932, the stocks took a nosedive by 90%. Say you were a 25-year-old who had invested $1,000 in Dow Jones that day. When you're retiring at 67 years of age, your $1,000 would in fact be $97,000. And with reinstated dividends adjusted for inflation, that's $604,000. This is a prime example of how quickly the compass can change from south to north. And to add to that, there's always going to be this ongoing skepticism about the market, especially when it surpasses previous highs. Today, the Dow Jones Industrial Average is at 38,000, which is 100 times higher than when the Congress people were worried that we had gone too far. If you tell someone today that 70 years from now the Dow Jones will be at 380,000, you would think that such a high achievement would be impossible. However, human beings can't predict how civilization will develop and grow in terms of economic development. Nobody knows where the Dow Jones will end up. As optimists, no matter how high your expectations are, we can go further than that. Just as you go high, you can drop, and that drop has a long way to go. The 90% haircut of the Depression could actually take Dow Jones back to 1995 level. The finance world is quite the gamble, but make sure you don't bet against America. Thanks you guys for watching. As always, please make sure to hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoyed it, and let me know what you think about Warren Buffett's comments regarding the Great Depression and our future here in the United States.